The note was folded twice, yellowed with age, and taped to the attic door, as if someone had wanted it to last longer than they did. Three words written in shaky ink stopped a trained Navy SEAL in his tracks more effectively than any ambush ever had. Don't open it! For a man who had walked through war zones, who had kicked down more than 40 doors under fire and stared into the worst humanity could offer, it should have meant nothing. But something about the handwriting, fragile and desperate and almost pleading, made his chest tighten in a way he couldn't explain. But to understand why Marcus Hale eventually opened that door, you need to know what he lost before he ever came here. 6 months earlier, Marcus Hale sat in a studio apartment in Virginia Beach, the city where Naval Special Warfare Command keeps its home, the city where most SEALs live between deployments. The apartment was small. It was clean in a way that wasn't healthy. Not a single photograph on the walls. Not a single piece of decoration. No sign that a living, breathing human being actually occupied the space. Just a single bed, a desk, and 3 cardboard boxes he hadn't opened since his discharge 6 months prior. On the desk, a half-empty water bottle and a prescription bottle. Prazosin, the medication doctors prescribe to veterans with PTSD to suppress nightmares. The bottle was full. He never took a single pill. Marcus Hale was 34 years old, 6'1", broad-shouldered but thinner than he used to be when he was operational. Dark brown hair cropped short by habit, gray-blue eyes inherited from his mother, an Irish woman from Boston he no longer spoke to. On his right forearm, the trident tattoo of the Navy SEALs, the symbol he once wore with pride, that now served only to remind him of things he wanted to forget. The scar on his left hand ran from the knuckle of his little finger to his wrist. He got it in Helmand Province, Afghanistan, during his final combat deployment in 2016. A piece of metal from an improvised explosive device. The military surgeon offered to clean it up. Marcus refused, not out of courage, because he felt he deserved the scar. He didn't drink, not out of discipline, because alcohol made the nightmares sharper. He couldn't sleep more than 3 hours a night. When he did sleep, he always lay facing the door with one hand under his pillow, reaching for a sidearm that was no longer there. He had removed the pistol from under his pillow the night he woke up holding it and couldn't remember reaching for it. Marcus had joined the Navy in 2008. He completed Bud/S at Coronado, California, the most brutal military training program in the United States, with a dropout rate exceeding 75%. He was assigned to SEAL Team 5 based out of Coronado. His first deployment to Afghanistan came in 2012 under Operation Enduring Freedom. 4 combat rotations over 5 years. The last rotation, 2016 to 2017, was the one that changed everything. Every night the same dream came back. A village, gunfire, dust that tasted like blood and copper, and the sound of a child calling out, not in English, in Pashto. A small voice, terrified, repeating a single word that Marcus had translated long ago but could never bring himself to say aloud. And in the dream, he always ran toward that voice. But he never made it in time. He always woke before he reached the door. If you have ever had a dog that understood you better than any person in your life, take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who knows what that kind of bond feels like. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button now, because what happens next in this story will stay with you for a long time. Ranger lay by the front door of the apartment, not because he liked the spot, because it was a tactical position, placing himself between Marcus and any threat that might come from outside. 6 years in the military had taught the dog that, and 2 years of civilian life hadn't made him forget. Ranger was a Belgian Malinois, 6 years old. The breed became the gold standard for special operations canine units after a Malinois named Cairo participated in the 2011 raid that killed Osama bin Laden. Ranger had served as a military working dog specializing in explosive detection. His nose had saved the team's lives at least 3 times in Afghanistan. When Marcus was discharged in 2018, Ranger retired with him under the Robbie's Law Program, a federal law signed in 2000 by President Clinton, allowing veterans to adopt military working dogs after their service ends. Ranger was not a pet. He was Marcus's last teammate. When Marcus woke in the dead of night, gasping, drenched in sweat, Ranger was already there, not because of training, because he understood. He had been in the same war. He had smelled the same gunpowder, the same blood, the same fear that humans can't consciously detect but dogs remember forever. There was one habit that set Ranger apart. Every time the dog entered a new space, he would sniff every corner, check every angle, and then lie down in the position he judged safest. In the Virginia Beach apartment, he always lay between Marcus and the front door, as if he was still on duty, as if the war had never ended. Marcus decided to leave Virginia Beach on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Nothing dramatic happened, no final straw. He simply looked out the window, saw the ocean, saw the beach where SEAL teams trained every morning, and realized that every day in this city was another day he was reminded of what he had lost. He wanted to disappear, not die. He had moved past that edge, though only barely. He wanted to be somewhere nobody knew him, somewhere nobody would ask, "Are you okay?" In that careful voice people use on veterans, the voice that manages to be respectful and pitying at the same time, the voice that treats you like a cracked statue. He found the house on a small real estate website that specialized in problem properties, foreclosures, abandoned homes, houses nobody wanted, not Zillow, not Redfin, a local Maine listing with grainy photos and sparse descriptions. The house appeared on page 3. 3 bedrooms, 2 stories, built approximately 1923, sitting on 4 acres of land, 15 minutes from the nearest town. Price $47,000. $47,000 for a 3 bedroom house on 4 acres. Even in rural Maine, where real estate runs well below the national average, that number was suspiciously low. A normal person would have asked why. Marcus didn't ask. After what he had been through, he didn't want answers. He wanted distance. He wired the payment directly, signed the paperwork over email, and the next morning, he loaded everything he owned into his 2009 Ford F-150, put Ranger in the passenger seat, and drove north. The drive from Virginia Beach to northern Maine took roughly 14 hours. Marcus drove without stopping, through Washington and Baltimore and New York and Connecticut and Massachusetts and New Hampshire, and then into Maine. The landscape changed gradually. Crowded highways gave way to narrow 2-lane roads bordered by pine and birch. The farther north he went, the fewer cars, the fewer people, the less noise, the closer it felt to what he was searching for. Ranger sat still the entire drive. Occasionally the dog would turn his head and look at Marcus, checking. Then he would look back out the window. Somewhere around New Hampshire, the sun set and painted the maple forests red. Marcus didn't stop to look. He just drove. He arrived close to midnight. The headlights swept across the house in the darkness, and it was larger than he expected. A classic New England farmhouse from the early 20th century. Steep roof, white clapboard siding that had weathered to gray, a wide front porch with a sagging wooden railing. 2 large maple trees flanked the entrance, their branches bare. Maine in early November. Autumn was over. Winter hadn't fully arrived. That empty space between seasons, the loneliest stretch of the year. Marcus killed the engine, sat in the truck, listened to the engine tick as it cooled. Then he opened the door. The Maine night air hit his face, cold, dry, carrying the smell of rotting leaves and damp earth. Nothing like the salt air of Virginia Beach. Nothing like the scorching dust of Helmand. He let Ranger out. The dog immediately began his routine, what Marcus called the perimeter check. Ranger circled the house, nose to the ground, ears up, eyes scanning. 2 minutes later, he returned and sat in front of the main door looking at Marcus. Signal clear. Outside was secure. Marcus opened the front door. The hinges screamed. The smell inside was old wood dust and something harder to name. The smell of a space that hadn't felt human warmth in far too long. Inside, old oak floors that creaked differently under each step. Cracked plaster walls, a 1950s kitchen with enameled steel cabinets, the kind your grandmother probably had. A rocking chair sitting alone in the living room, still in the darkness, as if waiting for someone. A small maple dining table. And on the kitchen wall, rectangular discolorations where family photos once hung. The photos were gone, but their ghosts remained pale shapes on the faded paint, like the outlines of faces that had moved on. Ranger entered the house, but he didn't run ahead to sniff like he normally would. The dog stopped at the threshold, ears straight up, nose working the air. Then he stepped inside slowly, cautiously, exactly the way he entered a building that needed clearing in Afghanistan. He checked the living room, the kitchen, the two downstairs bedrooms. Then he stopped at the foot of the staircase, looked up, and refused to go further. Marcus gave the command, "Up, Ranger! Check!" Ranger didn't move. The dog who had charged into buildings under gunfire, who had sprinted across mined ground, who had leaped from Black Hawk helicopters without hesitation, sat down at the bottom of the stairs, looked at Marcus with those watchful eyes, and whined softly. This was the first time in 6 years that Marcus had seen Ranger refuse an order. And for a man who had learned the hard way that his dog's instincts were more reliable than any intelligence briefing, that was not something he could ignore. Marcus went up alone. The flashlight beam cut through the dark hallway. Two bedrooms, empty, dusty windows filmed over. A small bathroom faucet rusted. And at the end of the hall, on the ceiling, the attic door with a pull cord hanging down. The note, "Don't open it." Marcus stood there, light on the shaky handwriting, the smeared ink, the yellowed paper, the darkened tape. Someone had written these three words with an unsteady hand. Someone had taped this note here, hoping it would outlast them. From downstairs, Ranger whined again, not loud, but enough. "Not tonight," Marcus murmured. He was talking to himself more than to the dog, and the words were heavier than they should have been. That first night, Marcus sat up in the downstairs bedroom because Ranger wouldn't go upstairs, and Marcus couldn't sleep without Ranger nearby. He laid his sleeping bag over the old mattress, put the flashlight on the nightstand, and lay down. He had brought very little. A bag of clothes, toiletries, dog food, a box of old photographs he hadn't opened, and one book, The Odyssey by Homer, a dog-eared paperback, the Robert Fagles translation. The spine cracked, the pages yellowed. Danny Vega had given it to him before the last deployment. Danny had highlighted one passage in yellow marker, the passage where Odysseus returns to Ithaca after 20 years of war and wandering. And it is his old dog Argos, lying on a pile of dung, sick and neglected, who recognizes him first. Not his wife, not his son, his dog. Danny said, "You see that hail 20 years. The dog waited 20 years. That's loyalty, not the medals they pin on our chests." Danny never came home to finish reading that book. On the cover there was a stain, dark brown, dried, hard spread in an uneven shape. Blood. Marcus never cleaned it. He never would. The house made sounds that first night. Normal sounds. Wood contracting in the cold November air when temperatures outside dropped close to freezing. Wind threading through window gaps. Maple branches scraping the roof. All explainable. But there was something else. From above. From the attic. Not creaking, not wind. A dragging sound. Slow, heavy, rhythmic. As if something was being pulled across the wooden floor from one end to the other, then back again. Drag. Pause. Drag. Marcus lay still. His body switched automatically into the mode that anyone who has seen combat knows. Heart rate slowed. Breathing steady. Every sense focused on the source of the sound. He pinpointed the location directly above the bedroom, approximately 10 feet overhead, moving along an east to west axis, roughly 12 feet per pass. Ranger lay beside the bed, head raised, ears, locked forward, eyes fixed on the ceiling, his whole body rigid. But he didn't bark, didn't growl, as if he too was listening, trying to understand. The dragging stopped. Silence. 10 seconds, 20, 30. Then it started again. Same rhythm, same trajectory. Then Ranger did something Marcus had never seen before. The dog placed one front paw on Marcus's chest gently, then lay down on top of him. The familiar weight warm and solid. This was deep pressure therapy, a technique used by psychiatric service dogs to calm PTSD patients during anxiety episodes. Ranger had been trained as an explosive detection dog, not a psychiatric service dog. But over 2 years of living with Marcus, he had learned this on his own, through instinct, through 6 years of lying beside a man who was being destroyed from the inside. Marcus didn't sleep that first night, but he didn't panic. With Ranger's 35 kilograms pressing down on his chest, he didn't panic. The dragging sound continued until nearly dawn. Then it stopped, as if whatever was up there also needed rest. Morning came with a strange relief. The November light, pale and slanted, filled the house and turned it from something frightening into something merely old and sad. Marcus told himself it was nothing. Old house, wood settling. Maybe raccoons in the attic, a common enough problem in rural Maine, where the animals often nest in abandoned structures to shelter through winter. But Ranger still refused to go upstairs. The days that followed, Marcus tried to build a routine. He woke at 5 every morning, a military habit that had calcified into something he couldn't break, same as the way he still assessed every room by its number of exits. He ran 5 miles on the dirt road out front with Ranger, regardless of the weather. Maine in November meant thick fog and temperatures near freezing, and ice forming thin sheets on the road. In the afternoons, he fixed things. He was good with his hands. In the seals, everyone learned to build, repair, improvise. He replaced door locks, repaired the staircase rail, patched cracks in the plaster. The physical work helped him not think. When his hands were busy, his mind was quiet. In the evenings, he sat on the front porch with black coffee, watching the tree line. Sometimes a white-tailed deer would step out of the forest, pausing at the edge of the yard, ears swiveling. Ranger would watch, but never chase. He was too old and too tired for that. And every night the sound returned. Same rhythm, same location, same patient, unnerving persistence. By the 5th night, something new, a knocking sound. 2 taps, like knuckles on wood, like someone was knocking on the attic door, from the inside. By the 6th night, 3 taps, then 4, then a continuous sequence accelerating like small fingers drumming on a wooden floor, rhythmic, urgent, almost desperate. On the 7th day, Marcus was repairing the front porch railing when an old pickup truck, a Chevrolet C10 from around 1985, faded green, came crawling along the dirt road and stopped. An old woman stepped out. Ruth Pemberton, 78 years old. White hair pulled up in a bun, her face scored with deep lines, but eyes that were still sharp and blue and missed nothing. She wore a Carhartt jacket, the brand that practically every rural New Englander lives in, and rubber boots. In her hands, an apple pie in an aluminum tray covered with a checkered cloth. "Good morning, I'm Ruth. I live in the house down the other end of this road. Saw a new truck parked here, so I brought pie. That's how we welcome neighbors around here." The conversation started normally, the kind of measured, quiet greeting that rural New England is known for, where people say little but show up with food when it counts. Ruth didn't ask many questions. She was a true Mainer, the kind who watches more than speaks but never misses a thing. She noticed the trident tattoo on Marcus's forearm when he reached for the pie tray. She didn't ask about it. She just said quietly, "My son served too, Navy, not SEALs but Navy. He was killed in Beirut, 83. October 23, 1983. A suicide truck bomb struck the United States Marine Barracks in Beirut, Lebanon. 241 American servicemen were killed, including 220 Marines. It remains one of the deadliest attacks on American military personnel since the Vietnam War. Ruth's son, Kevin Pemberton, was 20 years old. He was one of them. Marcus looked at Ruth, and in that moment, on the worn porch of a forgotten house in the smell of apple pie and cold November air, Two people from two different generations of war looked at each other with the understanding that only those who have lost someone to combat can share. When Ruth turned to leave, Marcus asked. He tried to keep his voice casual, as if the question didn't matter much. Do you know anything about this house, about the people who lived here before? Ruth paused. Her hand rested on the truck door. She didn't turn around right away. The silence stretched 4 seconds, 5 seconds long enough for Marcus to know this was not a simple question. The Whitfield family, Ruth said, her voice quieter now. Thomas and Maggie. They had a daughter. Have or had? Ruth turned to look at him. Her blue eyes carried something Marcus recognized instantly. It was the same look he had seen on the faces of mothers in Afghanistan when he asked about their children. Loss that had become not an emotion but a permanent feature of the face, like geography. When you're ready, Ruth said, come see me, I'll tell you. She drove away. Ranger watched the truck disappear down the road. His tail didn't wag. On the 10th night, Marcus could no longer wait. The sounds had evolved. The knocking had become frantic, desperate, a rapid drumming that rose and then stopped dead. Silence. And in that silence, Marcus heard, or thought he heard, a voice. Small, high, a child's voice. One word, just one word repeated thin as morning frost. Daddy. Marcus sat bolt upright, heart hammering. His hand reached for the flashlight automatically. The combat reflex that searches for a weapon for light, for control. Ranger stood up, body rigid, muzzle pointed at the ceiling. That word. Daddy. It wasn't frightening in the way gunfire was frightening. It was worse, because it reached down and found the thing Marcus had buried deepest. The voice of Amara. The little girl in Afghanistan. The child he had heard calling through the wall in Pashto. And when he kicked the door open, it was already too late. He would not let it be too late again. Marcus stood up. For the first time, Ranger followed him up the stairs. He pulled the cord. The folding ladder dropped with a long agonized creak. The air from above poured down colder than the rest of the house, carrying dust, rotting wood, and something older than either. The smell of time that had stopped moving. He climbed, each rung groaning under his weight. Ranger climbed behind him, claws scratching on old wood. The attic was smaller than he expected. The pitched roof created a low vault, standing room only in the center. The flashlight swept across old cardboard boxes, a wooden cradle thick with dust, an antique Singer-Treadle sewing machine. And in the far corner, a wooden chest, hand-built from pine. The kind of thing a carpenter would make himself. The surface smoothed by decades, the corners rounded with age, but the joints still tight. On the lid, 2 letters had been carved with a woodworking knife, deep and clear. C.W. Clara Whitfield. Ranger went straight to the chest, but he didn't bark. He lay down beside it, placed his muzzle on the wooden lid, and whimpered softly. Not anxiety, something else. The sound a dog makes when lying beside someone who is sick. The sound of care. Marcus looked at the floor. Under the flashlight beam, scratches appeared in the wood. Not random. Parallel lines, deep worn into grooves running from the cradle to the chest and back again. Hundreds of passes. As if someone had dragged the cradle back and forth between 2 points over years, wearing ruts into the pine floor. Marcus knelt beside the chest. The brass lock was tarnished but not locked, just latched, as if whoever closed it last couldn't bear to truly lock it. He opened the lid. Inside, children's clothing. Small dresses, hand-knitted sweaters, tiny socks. All folded with care, layered neatly as if someone had spent a long time arranging them. Between the layers, a small teddy bear, worn one eye, missing stuffing, poking through the shoulder seam. A children's picture book, Goodnight Moon, by Margaret Wise Brown. A well-worn copy with the cover faded and the corners curled. And at the bottom, an envelope. Inside the envelope, 2 things. A Polaroid photograph. A little girl, light brown hair, big eyes, a smile, missing one front tooth, standing in front of this house. The house when it was newer, the walls white, the garden in full bloom. The girl held the teddy bear. The same bear now lying in the chest, but back then it had both eyes and full stuffing and looked loved instead of lost. On the back of the photo in ballpoint pen, Clara's 6th birthday, March 1987, and a letter, handwritten, 2 pages on lined paper, the same handwriting as the note on the attic door. Marcus began to read, but before he finished the first sentence, the flashlight flickered and went dark. Darkness swallowed the attic. Complete, absolute. Ranger whined but didn't run. The dog pressed tight against Marcus's leg, warm, solid, steady. And in the darkness, Marcus felt not heard, not saw, but felt that someone else was in the attic. Not threatening, not hostile, just there, waiting. Marcus spoke into the dark, his voice rough. "I'll read the letter." He slapped the flashlight against his palm, the old soldier's trick, and the beam came back unsteady at first, then solid. Marcus read the letter in the attic, his back against the chest. The flashlight wedged between his shoulder and his ear. The way every special operator learns to hold a light when both hands need to be free. Ranger lay beside him, muzzle still resting on the lid of the chest, eyes closed but ears standing straight. The dog was not sleeping. The dog was listening. The letter was 2 pages long, written on lined notebook paper, the kind you tear from a spiral-bound pad. The handwriting started clear and controlled the penmanship of a careful man, someone accustomed to writing measurements and lumber dimensions and job estimates. But as the pages went on, the letters began to shake, as if the man who started writing with steady hands had been betrayed by the memories his hands were putting down. Thomas Whitfield wrote this letter in 1997, 10 years after everything happened. 10 years is long enough for a man to believe he has forgotten, but also long enough to realize that forgetting is impossible. Thomas wrote that his wife Margaret, everyone called her Maggie, died of lung cancer in 1986. Maggie never smoked. The doctor said lung cancer in non-smokers was not uncommon, accounting for roughly 10 to 15% of all lung cancer cases in the United States. But statistics do not comfort anyone standing beside a hospital bed, watching the woman they love disappear one breath at a time. Maggie was 32 years old when she died. Clara had just turned 5. Marcus stopped reading at that point. He looked at the Polaroid photograph. The little girl in the picture was smiling. Behind that smile, her mother had already been dead for a year. Thomas continued. After Maggie passed, he tried to raise Clara alone. He was a carpenter. He worked from home so he could watch his daughter. But he did not know how to comfort a child who had lost her mother. He knew how to build cabinets and tables and roof frames. He did not know how to explain death to a 5-year-old in a way she could understand without being destroyed by it. Then Clara started talking to the attic. Every evening after dinner, Clara would climb up to the attic, the room where Maggie used to sit and sew, where the Singer treadle machine still stood, where the faint scent of Maggie's lavender perfume still lingered in the fabric and the wood. And Clara would sit there for hours. Thomas could hear his daughter talking through the ceiling. A small voice, cheerful, conversational, as if she was speaking with someone who was actually there. "Mommy, I drew a picture at school today. The teacher said it was beautiful. I drew you and me standing in front of our house." Thomas thought it was a normal response to grief. The books on childhood psychology that the church pastor lent him said that young children often create imaginary companions after losing a loved one, a defense mechanism, perfectly normal. He decided to leave it alone. Maybe with time, Clara would stop going up to the attic. But the opposite happened. Clara began dragging the cradle, the wooden cradle that Thomas had built himself, the cradle where Maggie used to lay baby Clara down to sleep, across the attic floor to a spot next to the chest. And every night, Clara slept in that cradle. 6 years old already, too big for it, her legs hanging over the edge, but she insisted. Because she told Thomas, "Mommy tucks me in when I sleep up here." That was the sound Marcus heard every night since moving in. Not something dragging now, the memory of it. Repeated hundreds of times over months and years, ground into the grain of the wood. until the house itself remembered. Then Thomas's handwriting began to shake badly, the letters tilting, the ink smearing in places as if his hand was trembling too hard to hold the pen steady. Strange things started happening. Objects moved on their own. The rocking chair in the living room would be in a slightly different position every morning, angled as if someone had just been sitting in it and stood up. The singer-sewing machine in the attic would start running in the middle of the night, the rhythmic clack of the metal treadle echoing through the silent house, steady and unhurried. Exactly the way Maggie used to work the pedal while mending Clara's dresses. And one night, Thomas climbed up to check on Clara and found the child asleep in the cradle, teddy bear clutched to her chest, a blanket tucked carefully around her up to her chin. Neat, warm, snug, tight on the left side, loose on the right, because Clara liked to keep one arm free, exactly the way Maggie always did it. But Thomas had not tucked Clara in that night. He hadn't gone up to the attic at all. No one had tucked Clara in, and yet the blanket was there. Thomas wrote, "I am not a superstitious man. I am a carpenter. I believe in things I can measure, cut, and join. I went to the Congregational church every Sunday because Maggie wanted me to. And I kept going after she died because it was habit. I do not believe in ghosts, but I believe what I saw. And I saw a blanket on my daughter that nobody placed there." Thomas was afraid, not of Maggie. He made that clear. "I was never afraid of my wife living or dead." He was afraid that Clara was being held back, that even though Maggie loved Clara, and that love was real, the only thing Thomas never doubted, that love was preventing the child from moving on. Clara stopped playing with other children. She didn't want to go to school. She only wanted to be in the attic. She only wanted to be with Mommy. In 1988, when Clara was 7, Thomas made his decision. He sold the house and moved away. He packed the chest, placed all of Clara's things inside the teddy bear, the clothes, the photographs, the book, as a way of returning that part of their life to the house. He taped the note to the attic door. "Don't open it." Not a warning for strangers, a warning for himself. To remind himself not to come back, not to open it again, not to let the pain pull him under. The letter ended with this passage, and Marcus read it aloud, his voice raw in the cold attic. "I don't know if Maggie is really there. I only know that my daughter heard her mother when nobody else could, and I hate to take my child away from the house she loved most in the world. If anyone reads this letter, please understand. I did not abandon my wife. I was trying to save my daughter." Marcus set the letter down, and then he noticed something he had missed the first time. At the bottom corner of the last page, written in a different pen, a different hand. The letters were smaller, rounder, uneven in size, leaning in different directions. The handwriting of a child who was still learning to form words. "Daddy will come back." Clara had found the letter, and she had added her own promise. Marcus held the page with both hands, and for the first time since arriving at the house, he felt something beyond alertness. He felt sad, the kind of sadness that makes your breathing heavy and your ribs feel too small for your lungs. To understand why this letter from a carpenter in Maine broke something open inside a Navy SEAL from Virginia Beach, you need to know what happened 7 years before on the other side of the world, in a village that military maps only marked with coordinates. Sangin District, Helmand Province, one of the most dangerous regions in Afghanistan, a place where poppy fields grew taller than a man and blood had soaked deeper into the earth than the roots ever could. Most American forces had withdrawn by 2014, but Special Operations units still deployed to support Afghan National Army Special Operations Command against the Taliban. SEAL Team 5, 6-man element. Marcus Hale was the assistant team leader. Daniel Vega, everyone called him Danny, was the primary marksman. Danny Vega, 28 years old. Puerto Rican from the Bronx, New York. Enlisted in the Navy at 19, earned his trident at 22. The happiest person on the team. Always carried a book with him. an unusual habit among operators who mostly packed sports magazines or downloaded movies. Danny cooked mofongo, the traditional Puerto Rican dish, made from fried and mashed plantains using MRE ingredients, and somehow it was actually good. Danny sang quietly while on patrol, usually something by Hector Lavoe, and nobody told him to stop, because Danny had a voice that made the Afghan dark feel less hostile. Danny had a saying he repeated whenever things got bad. The ocean doesn't know you're a seal, Hale. It still tries to drown you. The things you're scared of don't know you're brave either, but you keep swimming. If you served in Afghanistan, or if someone you love did, this next part of Marcus's story may be difficult to hear, but it is a story that deserves to be told. If you believe that the sacrifices of our veterans should never be forgotten, take a moment to share this video with someone who needs to hear it. The Night Mission, August 2016. The target was a compound identified by intelligence as an IED assembly site. Standard night raid. Stack formation at the door. Breacher set the frame charge. Bang out, and they went in. Ground floor clear, empty. Second floor, one room full of IED components. Wire metal pipes, batteries, detonators. Intel confirmed. But there was one more door. End of the hallway, second floor. Closed. Danny went first. Marcus right behind. 2 steps apart. Danny kicked the door. Behind it, not Taliban fighters. A woman, Afghan, around 30, sitting in the corner. Beside her, a little girl approximately 7 years old. Wide eyes, terrified, clutching a handmade cloth doll, the kind with no face, just fabric and yarn. 4 seconds. The explosion came from inside the door frame. An IED built into the wall. A trap. The kind of trap they usually checked for, but on that night, for reasons Marcus would torture himself with for 7 years, they missed. Danny took the full blast. Marcus was thrown backward into the hallway, his back slamming against the wall, a piece of metal embedding itself in his left hand, the scar he carries every day. When Marcus regained consciousness, maybe seconds later, maybe longer time in combat, doesn't measure by clocks. Danny lay motionless. His eyes were open, but they saw nothing. The copy of the Odyssey in Danny's jacket pocket was soaked through with blood. The room was partially collapsed, and Marcus could hear through the ringing in his ears, through the dust, through the acrid smell of explosive, a sound. Crying. The little girl was alive. Her mother was not. Marcus tried to crawl toward the crying, but the team leader ordered immediate withdrawal. The building was compromised structurally on sound, could collapse at any moment. 2 teammates grabbed Marcus and dragged him out. Down the hallway, down the stairs, through the front door, out into the Afghan night where the stars were brighter than anywhere he had ever been. The girl's crying grew fainter as they dragged Marcus away. She was calling for her mother, in Pashto. One word repeated more. Mother. Danny Vega died at the scene. The girl, according to the classified after-action report that Marcus accessed months later, was extracted by the quick reaction force that arrived afterward. She survived. But Marcus never learned where she went, who took her, whether she was safe. The military system does not track civilians. She disappeared into Afghanistan like millions of other children. No name in any official record. But Marcus gave her a name in his mind, Amara, and her voice calling for her mother became the sound that played behind every nightmare for 7 years. In the cold attic in Maine, Marcus looked at the Polaroid photograph of Clara Whitfield, a 6-year-old girl smiling with a missing tooth, and saw Amara. He looked at Thomas Whitfield's letter, a father who didn't know how to save his child, and saw himself. He looked at the chest full of small clothes and a one-eyed teddy bear, and saw all the things he had failed to protect. Thomas Whitfield could not save his family. He had to leave, abandoning the house and its memories. Marcus Hale could not save Danny and Amara. He was dragged out, leaving them behind. Both men were haunted by a door they had not opened the right way or had opened too late. The next morning, Marcus drove to Ruth Pemberton's house. 15 minutes down the dirt road through bare birch forest under the flat grey sky that is November in Maine. The kind of grey that isn't sat just empty like an unwritten page. Ruth's house was smaller. Tidy, a classic Cape Cod, 1.5-story steep roof, red brick chimney trailing smoke. The front door was painted deep red, traditional New England style. Inside, the kitchen was warm from a wood stove, and the air smelled of coffee, burning pine, and something baking. On the wall, a photograph of Kevin Pemberton in his navy dress uniform. A young face, 20 years old, wide smile. Beside it, a folded American flag in a glass case, the triangle fold they give to the families of the fallen. Ruth poured coffee, black, no sugar, the Maine way, and began to talk. She told Marcus about Maggie Whitfield, a preschool teacher at the town school. Light brown hair, warm brown eyes, a voice so gentle that the children in her class would fall asleep when she read to them. Everyone loved Maggie. When she was diagnosed, the community organized a fundraiser at the Congregational Church on Main Street. But in 1986, health insurance in rural Maine barely existed for working-class families. Maggie died in November when the maple leaves outside the window blazed red. Ruth said that Clara told her right after the funeral, "Mrs. Ruth, Mommy will come back when the leaves turn red." Ruth didn't know what to say. She just held the child. Ruth told Marcus that after Thomas moved Clara to Portland, Maine's largest city, Clara grew up quietly. Good grades, no trouble. But Clara came back to the old house once when she was 16 in 1997. I looked out my window and saw a girl standing in front of the house. Brown hair, thin, wearing a black jacket. It took me a few seconds to realize it was Clara. She stood there for 15 minutes, looking up at the second-floor windows. Then she left. She didn't go inside. Ruth told Marcus something else. After Thomas and Clara moved away, the house was sold twice over the following 30 years. The first buyers, a young couple from Boston, who wanted to live simply in the country, lasted 8 months before moving out. No explanation, no complaint. They just left. The second buyer, a retired college professor who wanted to write a book, lasted 3 years before selling the house at a loss of $15,000 below what he paid. I asked the professor why he was selling. Ruth said. He told me, "The house doesn't want me there." I asked him what he meant. He just shook his head and drove away. Ruth was clear about one thing. The house never harmed anyone. Nobody was injured. Nobody fell ill. Nobody experienced unusual bad luck. There were no ghostly footsteps, no flying objects, nothing like the movies. Just a feeling. The feeling that you were not welcome. That the house was waiting for someone and you were not that person. "But you're different," Ruth said, looking at Marcus over the rim of her coffee cup. "You've been there 10 days, longer than anyone since Thomas." She looked down at Ranger lying under the kitchen table, his muzzle resting on a rubber boot. "And your dog seems like he knows something." Marcus asked, "Why do you think I've lasted longer?" Ruth was silent. She lifted her coffee, drank slowly, set it down, looked at Marcus with those blue eyes that had seen 40 years of living since the day she received a folded flag. "Maybe because you carry your own dead." The words landed somewhere deep inside Marcus's chest. Quiet kitchen, fire crackling, Ranger breathing steadily, and Marcus hailed the man who had walked through war without weeping, who had lost his best friend without breaking, who had lived with nightmares without screaming, felt something inside his chest crack, not shatter, just crack, like thin ice on a lake when spring arrives. 3 weeks after moving in, Marcus was repairing the walls of the upstairs bedroom. It was the first time he had worked on the second floor, because Ranger had finally agreed to climb the stairs. Though the dog still moved slowly, cautiously, his gaze always sweeping. When Marcus pulled away a panel of old wainscoting, the white painted pine that lines the lower walls of almost every New England house built before 1940, he found something in the gap between the panel and the real wall, a small tin box. The kind that once held hard candy or rolling tobacco, the picture on the lid almost entirely faded. Inside the box, 7 drawings in colored pencil on paper. The kind of art a 6 or 7-year-old produces. The lines were wobbly and imprecise, but filled with the unmistakable intensity that only children's art contains. Each drawing showed a different scene, but all of them featured 2 figures. A tall woman, the mother always wearing a blue dress, and a small girl, Clara, brown hair, holding a teddy bear. In every single drawing, the 2 of them were holding hands. The first drawing, Mother and Clara standing in a flower garden. A large yellow sun overhead, both of them smiling. The second mother reading a book to Clara in bed. The third mother sitting at the Singer sewing machine, Clara beside her watching. The fourth mother cooking in the kitchen, Clara standing on a chair to reach the counter. The fifth mother and Clara running through a meadow, dragonflies and butterflies filling the sky. The sixth mother holding Clara in bed, a moon in the window, and the seventh. The seventh drawing was different from all the rest. No grass, no sunshine, no cheerful colors. In this one, the house was drawn in simple lines, a square with a triangle roof. The mother stood in the attic, which Clara represented as a small triangle at the very top. The mother still wore her blue dress, but she was not smiling. She was looking down. The little girl stood on the ground looking up. Between the 2 figures, Clara had drawn a straight line connecting the mother's hand to the daughter's hand. But the line was broken in the middle, severed. The 2 halves didn't touch. And at the break, in wobbly oversized letters, Clara had written one word, soon. Clara was not talking to the attic. Clara was waiting. Waiting for the day the line would be whole again. Waiting for the day she could hold her mother's hand. Waiting for soon. And when Thomas took Clara away, he didn't just separate his daughter from her house. He separated her from her mother for the second time. Marcus set the drawing down. His hands were shaking. And then Ranger did something that made Marcus go very still. The dog was staring into the corner of the room, an empty corner, nothing there, no one there. But Ranger was looking at that corner with focused eyes and a tilted head, the posture Marcus only ever saw when the dog was looking at a person. And Ranger's tail wagged, slowly, once, twice. The first time Ranger had wagged his tail on the second floor since they arrived. And in that moment, brief enough that Marcus was not certain it was real, he caught a scent. Not dust, not old wood, not anything that belonged to this house. Lavender, faint, warm, the kind of scent that is only familiar when it belongs to someone you love. That evening, Marcus asked Ruth for Thomas Whitfield's contact information. Ruth hesitated. After all these years, she said, but she gave it. Thomas Whitfield was 72 now, living in a nursing home near Bangor, Maine. Early-stage Parkinson's disease. His hands shook, he could no longer write, but his memory was sharp. Sometimes a sharp memory is more curse than blessing. The phone call lasted 40 minutes. Thomas was silent for a long time when Marcus told him he had read the letter. "Did you hear it?" Thomas finally asked. The dragging sound. "Yes. That's the cradle. Maggie used to pull Clara's cradle back and forth to rock her to sleep every night. It was the only way Clara would settle. And even after Maggie passed, the sound was still there. I checked. The cradle never moved, but the sound was there." Thomas told Marcus about Clara now. She was 42, living in Portland, working as a pediatric nurse at Maine Medical Center. She had never married. She had no children. Thomas didn't say why, or perhaps he knew, but couldn't bring himself to speak it. Then Thomas said something that stopped Marcus cold. "Do you know why I wrote 'Don't open it'? It wasn't because I was afraid of the attic. It was because the last time I opened that chest, I sat on the attic floor all night, holding Clara's teddy bear, smelling Maggie's perfume on the blankets. And I wanted to stay. I wanted to lie down right there, close my eyes, and never leave. Silence on the line. Only Thomas is breathing. Heavy, uneven. That note isn't a warning for strangers. It's a warning for me. So I wouldn't go back. Because if I went back, I would never leave again. And Clara would lose her father too. Marcus understood, deeply painfully in his bones. Thomas was not afraid of ghosts. Thomas was afraid of himself, afraid that the grief would swallow him whole if he gave it the chance. The same way Marcus was afraid of his nightmares, not afraid of the dreams themselves, but afraid that facing them would finally break him. The phone call ended with Thomas asking one question. Does Clara know you're there? No. Maybe she should. Maybe it's time. I'll call her tonight and tell her about you. If she wants to talk, she'll reach out. Marcus set the phone down and waited. 3 days later, his phone buzzed with a text message from an unfamiliar number. This is Clara Whitfield. My father told me someone is living in our old house. I don't know if I want to talk about this, but I think I need to. They agreed to meet at a coffee shop near Maine Medical Center in Portland. Not the hospital itself, but a place nearby where they could sit and talk without the noise of a ward around them. Marcus drove to Portland on a Tuesday morning in late November. 4 hours south through the heart of Maine, past Bangor and Augusta, and dozens of small towns connected by old wooden bridges over frozen streams. The coffee shop had red brick walls, wooden chairs, the smell of dark roast. The kind of New England cafe that might have been there 50 years, or might have opened last week, impossible to tell, because the style never changes. Marcus arrived early. He sat in a corner booth with Ranger lying under the table, the dog's leash looped around the chair leg, his service vest on. Ranger had been officially registered as a psychiatric service dog through the VA 6 months after Marcus's discharge, a process Danny's mother had helped him navigate before Marcus moved to Maine. The vest gave Ranger legal access to public spaces under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Clara arrived 10 minutes later. She wore a dark jacket over scrubs as if she had come straight from a shift. Light brown hair cut short and practical. Her eyes were her mother's eyes from the Polaroid, but deeper now, more tired, carrying the weight of decades that included losing a mother, losing a home, and building a life on top of both losses without ever looking down. She saw Ranger before she saw Marcus. She stopped at the edge of the booth and looked at the dog. Ranger looked back at her, lifted his head from the floor, and did something unexpected. He placed his chin on Clara's shoe, a gesture of trust he had never offered anyone except Marcus. Clara sat down. She didn't say hello. She said, "Your dog just did something my father's dog used to do." "What's that?" "Chose me." Marcus pulled the 7th drawing from his jacket pocket and placed it on the table between them. The house, the mother in the attic, the girl on the ground, the broken line, and the word soon. Clara looked at the drawing, and for the first time the wall cracked, not dramatically, not with sobbing or collapse. A single tear ran down her left cheek, just one. She wiped it quickly with her sleeve, the reflex of a nurse who wipes everything the same way, fast, efficient, leaving no trace. "I drew this," Clara whispered. "I was 6. If this conversation between Marcus and Clara is touching your heart, share this video with someone who understands what it means to carry something heavy for a very long time. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Because the way this story ends will stay with you. Clara told her version of the story. Different from Thomas's version. Different from Ruth's. The version that only the child who lived it could tell. "I remember the attic. I remember the smell of Mom's lavender perfume. I remember the sound of the sewing machine, the metal treadle pumping up and down, steady as a heartbeat. I remember the feeling of someone tucking me in when I slept in the cradle. The blanket was always warm, always tucked the right way. Tight on the left side, loose on the right, because I like to keep one arm free. Exactly the way Mom always did it." Clara paused, drank her coffee, set the cup down, looked out the window where snow was falling on the Portland streets, soft and white and quiet. "I was never afraid. Not once. Not ever. To me, Mom was just upstairs, the way she was always upstairs every evening when she was sewing. The only difference. She stopped again. The pause lasted long enough that Marcus could hear the espresso machine behind the counter, could hear the soft music from the speakers, could hear the snow. The only difference was that Mom didn't come downstairs in the morning anymore. Clara told Marcus what happened when Thomas took her to Portland. She did not cry because she was leaving the house. She cried because she was being separated from her mother for the second time. The first time was when Maggie died. The second time was when her father took her away from the only place where Maggie remained. I was 16 when I went back. I took the bus alone, didn't tell Dad. I stood in front of the house for 15 minutes. Why didn't you go inside? Because I was terrified. Not of what might be there, of what might not be there. Terrified that 30 years was too long, that I would climb up to the attic and find nothing but dust and rotting wood. Because if Mom wasn't there anymore, then she was really gone. And I didn't know how to live with that. Marcus looked at Clara. He looked at her hands. The hands of a nurse, hands that had held countless sick children, that had comforted countless frightened mothers, that had been strong for countless other people. Those hands were trembling now, wrapped around a coffee cup while snow fell outside. And he said the thing he had never said to anyone. Not to the therapist the VA sent, not to his teammates, not to himself during the long nights when saying it might have helped. I had a teammate named Danny. He was killed in Afghanistan right in front of me. The blast that got him should have been mine. He went through the door first and I went second, 2 steps apart. That's the distance between living and dying in Afghanistan. 2 steps. And every night I'm afraid to fall asleep. Not because of the nightmares, because I'm afraid that one day I won't dream about Danny anymore. Because if I stop dreaming about him, it means I've forgotten. And Danny deserves to be remembered. The silence that followed was long. The coffee shop existed around them, but didn't touch them. They were somewhere else, the two of them, in that space that only people who have lost someone essential ever visit. The country of grief that has no borders and no language but is recognized by everyone who has been there. My mother deserves to be remembered too, Clara said. Then go back. Don't be afraid of an empty attic. Being afraid is your right. Nobody can take that from you. But don't let fear keep you outside. Don't let 35 years become 40, 50, a lifetime. Clara looked down at the drawing, at the word soon written in the wobbly handwriting of the 6-year-old girl she had once been. It's been 35 years. Marcus glanced at Ranger. The dog still had his chin on Clara's shoe, his steady gaze looking up, tail moving slowly. In the book Danny gave me, the dog Argus waited for Odysseus for 20 years. Sometimes love doesn't know how to count. 2 weeks later, early December, Maine had its first real snow, the kind that transforms the world. The dirt road was white. The roof was white. The 2 bare maple trees wore white on every branch. The landscape looked like a blank page, clean and waiting to be written on. Clara arrived in an old Honda Civic, alone. She parked behind Marcus's truck, turned off the engine, and sat in the car for a long time. From the kitchen window, Marcus watched her. Watched the snow accumulating on the windshield, slowly erasing her from view. He did not go out to greet her. This was Clara's moment, not his. 35 years ago, a 6-year-old girl stood in this exact spot, holding her father's hand, crying because she was being pulled away. 19 years ago, a 16-year-old stood here for 15 minutes and then walked away because she was afraid. Now a 42-year-old woman stood here with snow on her shoulders, and this time she did not leave. Clara stepped out of the car and walked to the front door. She entered the house and began touching things. The wall, the staircase railing, the kitchen counter. She moved through the rooms like a blind person reading Braille, finding the house not with her eyes but with her fingertips. The house had changed. Marcus had repaired and cleaned and painted. but the bones were the same. The third step still creaked. The kitchen window still faced the two maples. The oak floor was still warm underfoot. Ranger ran to Clara the moment she crossed the threshold. The dog wagged his tail, whimpered, circled her legs, pressed his body against her shins. Behavior he reserved for Marcus alone, never for anyone else. But Clara was not anyone else. Not to this house, not to whatever Ranger could sense that no human instrument could measure. Clara knelt on the kitchen floor and wrapped her arms around the dog and cried. Not the quick, efficient tears she had wiped away in the coffee shop. She cried for real, the kind of crying that soaks through fur and reaches skin, the kind that shakes your whole body, the crying of a 6-year-old girl who had waited 35 years for permission to grieve out loud. Marcus stood in the kitchen doorway and said nothing. He gave her time. Time was the thing that Marcus had finally learned to give to others and to himself. 3 of them climbed the folding attic stairs, Marcus first, Clara behind him. Ranger between them, guarding both directions. The attic. Marcus had cleaned it, swept the cobwebs, dusted the surfaces. But the chest was untouched. The lid was open, waiting. Clara went straight to the chest, knelt down, and one by one she lifted each item out. A small dress. Mom made this for me. Blue floral fabric. I wore it on my first day of school. She held it against her chest. It was impossibly small. Everything from childhood is impossibly small when you find it again. A hand-knitted sweater. The smell of the yarn. It's still there. Clara pressed the sweater to her face, breathed in deeply, eyes closed. Whatever she found in that scent, it was enough to make her lips tremble. Tiny socks. I hated wearing socks. Mom always had to chase me around the house to get them on. A smile appeared. Small, shaky, but present. The copy of Goodnight Moon. Clara opened it to the first page where a line of faded ballpoint ink read, "For dear Clara, Christmas 1985. Love, Mom." Clara traced the handwriting with her fingertips slowly, as if she could feel her mother's hand moving beneath the ink. And the teddy bear. Clara picked up the bear with both hands. Gently, the way you hold something that might dissolve if you grip too tight. It was smaller than she remembered. Everything was smaller than she remembered, but also warmer. "Mom?" Clara's voice was barely there, thin and high, the voice of the 6-year-old girl who still lived inside the 42-year-old woman. "I'm home." Nothing dramatic happened. No burst of light, no whisper from the shadows, no objects moving, nothing like the movies. But both Marcus and Clara felt it. A shift in the air that could not be measured by any instrument, but was as real as the wooden floor beneath their knees. As if the attic or something within the attic had been holding its breath for a very long time. And now finally exhaled. Ranger lay down, in the center of the attic, not in the corner, not by the door, the center. The position he chose only when he had assessed a space as completely, absolutely safe. No threats, no alerts, all clear. And the dog closed his eyes, breathed slowly, slept. The first time since arriving at the house that Ranger fully relaxed in the attic. When Clara placed the teddy bear back in the chest, she noticed something Marcus had put there earlier, a dried flower. Its petals were withered, but still held their shape, still faintly yellow with a dark brown center. Clara touched a petal and said almost without thinking, the words coming from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. "This is a black-eyed Susan. This was Mom's favorite flower. She planted them all over the front yard. Every summer the whole garden was nothing but these, bright yellow everywhere." Marcus felt a chill move through his body, starting at the base of his skull and running down his spine. That flower had appeared on the lid of the chest 3 weeks earlier in the middle of November, when the outside temperature was below freezing, when the ground was iron-hard with frost, when no flower of any kind bloomed for hundreds of miles in any direction. He had not planted it. He had not brought it. It was simply there one morning, fresh and dewy, resting on the wooden lid, as if someone had just picked it from a summer garden. He said nothing. Some things are better without explanation. Some things are diminished by the attempt to explain them. That night, after Clara had gone home with a promise to return that Marcus believed not because she said it, but because of the way Ranger watched her walk to her car, tail wagging that quiet whimper, the way a dog says, "I'll see you again." Marcus sat on the front porch, alone except for Ranger, but Ranger was not alone. Ranger was an extension of Marcus himself. Snow fell lightly, no wind. The flakes came straight down slow and silent, the kind of snowfall that only Maine in deep winter produces, the kind you can hear landing if you listen. Marcus opened The Odyssey. The blood stain on the cover was still there, dark brown, permanent. He turned to the passage Danny had highlighted in yellow, the passage about Argos recognizing Odysseus. He read it aloud. His voice was rough in the cold air. Each breath formed a small white cloud in front of his face, giving visible shape to his words. Then he closed the book, set it on his knee, and spoke, not to the book, not to the snow, not to Ranger, to Danny. "Danny, I'm sorry I didn't go back for you. I'm sorry I'm alive and you're not. I'm sorry it took me 7 years to say this out loud." He paused, swallowed hard. Snow landed on his hair, his shoulders on the blood-stained page of a book that a dead man once loved. "But I'm not going to apologize for still being alive. Because you wouldn't want me to. You'd want me to cook terrible mofongo and read the books you highlighted. You'd want me to run every morning and sit on the porch every afternoon and sleep through the night. You'd want me to live like I mean it." Ranger raised his head, wagged his tail once, slowly, as if in agreement. Marcus closed the book, carefully, placed it back on his lap. And for the first time in 7 years, Marcus Hale cried. Not the crying of pain, not the crying of rage, the crying of a man who had finally given himself permission to let go. The crying of ice melting slow and steady and unstoppable, and when it was done underneath was water clear and still. The snow kept falling. Ranger pressed close against his side, and the house, the old house 100 years of standing, stood quiet in the darkness, warm, patient, as if it knew that finally the right person had come. 3 months later, spring, the snow melted. The 2 maples in front of the house sprouted pale green buds, thin and fragile but determined. The dirt road turned to mud and then dried. Birds returned. Chickadees, sparrows, the small familiar voices of a Maine spring. Marcus was still in the house. He had finished the roof, replaced the windows, repainted the exterior walls. Not white like before, but a pale gray with cream trim, traditional Maine style, but clean and cared for the way a man looks after he has started taking care of himself again. The front porch now had 2 rocking chairs, one old and restored, one new. Marcus slept 4 to 5 hours a night, not much by most standards. But for a man who once managed 3 hours of unbroken nightmares, it was a revolution. He still woke early, still ran with Ranger, but now he stopped along the way to watch a white-tailed deer step out from the tree line, to listen to the stream running behind the property, to breathe, just to breathe. He had started attending counseling sessions at the VA clinic in Bangor. Once a week, the long drive south, sitting in a room with a therapist who was herself a veteran, talking about things he had never talked about. It was slow, it was painful, but he kept going. Danny would have wanted him to keep going. He visited Thomas Whitfield at the nursing home twice. The first time was awkward, 2 men who shared a connection neither fully understood, sitting in a small room with too much fluorescent light and not enough words. The second time, Marcus brought photographs of the restored house printed at the local pharmacy. Thomas held the photos with shaking hands. Parkinson's making the images tremble, but his eyes were clear and bright in a way that only happens when you see something you love being cared for. "Beautiful," Thomas said softly. "Maggie would like that." Clara came back to the house once a month. She brought flowers. Black-eyed Susans when they were in season, other flowers when they weren't. She placed them on the lid of the chest in the attic. She sat quietly for 15 minutes, said nothing, just sat. Then she came downstairs and drank coffee with Marcus on the porch. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. Between them, there was no romance, no drama, just the quiet understanding of two people who had walked through darkness and come out the other side. The kind of friendship that only forms when both people know how long the night can be. One afternoon in late April, Marcus sat on the porch and wrote a letter. Not an email, not a text message. A handwritten letter on lined paper in ballpoint pen, the same way Thomas Whitfield had written his letter in the chest. Marcus wrote to Danny. He told Danny about the house, about Ranger, who was still healthy, still eating like a horse, still lying on top of Marcus every night. About Ruth and her apple pies, about Clara, the pediatric nurse. She takes care of other people's kids, Danny. You would have liked her. About the attic and the chest and the flower that appeared in the middle of winter. He didn't try to explain any of it. He just told the story. The way Danny used to tell stories, no logic required, just truth. At the end of the letter, Marcus wrote, "I don't know where you are, Danny. I don't know if you can hear this, but if you can, I want you to know something. I'm swimming. The ocean is still trying to drown me, but I'm still swimming." He folded the letter, put it in an envelope, didn't write an address because there was no address to write. He carried the letter up to the attic and placed it in the chest beside the teddy bear and Clara's photograph. Then he closed the lid. Maybe Maggie would hold it for Danny. Maybe somewhere that Marcus couldn't understand letters still reach the people they are meant for. Maybe not. But the act of writing it was enough. Ruth Pemberton came by every week with pie. Apple in fall, pumpkin in winter, blueberry in summer. She talked less these days, but smiled more. One evening on the porch, she said something quietly. "My son Kevin used to fish in the stream behind your property. Do you mind if I go sit by the water sometime?" "Any time, Mrs. Ruth." Ruth didn't fish. She sat beside the stream watching the water flow over the rocks and remembered Kevin. But now she remembered without pain, the same way Marcus remembered Danny without breaking, the same way Clara remembered Maggie without hiding. The attic was silent. The dragging sound never returned after the night Clara came home. But sometimes when Marcus went up to read, he had started reading more, beginning with the Odyssey and moving on to other books that Danny would have loved. Ranger would lift his head, prick his ears, stare into the corner of the room, and wag his tail. And Marcus would smile. He never asked why. One evening in May, Clara sent him a text message. "I just signed up for an evening drawing class in Portland. First time I've drawn anything since I was 7. The teacher asked me what I wanted to draw. I said, a house." Marcus read the message, smiled, typed back one sentence. "Don't forget the 2 maples." Ranger lay beside him, watching Marcus tap at the phone, tail wagging once before closing his eyes again. The dog didn't need to understand the message. He understood the sound of Marcus's breathing as he read it. Lighter, steadier. That was enough. A morning in June. Marcus opened the front door. The air was summer in Maine, warm, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth and freshly growing things. And there on the porch step, in the exact spot where snow had piled in December, in the exact spot where Marcus had sat and cried in the darkness, a flower was blooming. Just one, growing through a crack in the wooden step. A thin green stem, small leaves and petals the color of sunlight with a center as dark as rich earth. A black-eyed Susan. Marcus looked at the flower, looked at Ranger, who was sniffing the petals, his eyes bright in the early morning light. His tail swaying slowly, his whole body relaxed in a way that only a dog who feels completely safe can be. Marcus didn't say anything. He just sat down on the step, next to the flower, next to Ranger. He picked up his coffee, looked out at the forest where the deer appeared every morning, where the stream ran cold and clear beneath birch trees wearing their new leaves, where the sky was the deep, honest blue that Maine saves for summer. Marcus Hale had opened many doors in his life. Doors in Kandahar and Helmand and villages that had no names on any map. Behind every one of those doors, death might have been waiting. And he never hesitated. But the hardest door he ever opened was not in Afghanistan. It was in the ceiling of an old house in Maine, covered in dust, bearing a yellowed note in shaky handwriting. And behind that door was not death. It was the thing Marcus feared more than death. Life. Life with all its pain, and life with all its beauty. The note had been wrong, or perhaps misunderstood. Because sometimes the things we are told not to open are not meant to be avoided. They are meant to be faced with compassion. And when we face them, they don't just change what we find inside. They change us completely. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think about someone you have lost, or someone you haven't spoken to in too long, or a door you have been afraid to open, please share it. Share it with a veteran who needs to know he is not alone. Share it with a parent who is carrying something heavy. Share it with anyone who believes that love doesn't end. It just changes form. Like and subscribe and leave the word hope in the comments. If you believe that even the most broken places can find peace again, thank you for staying until the end. It means more than you know.